Hello, everybody. My name is Pablo Boczkowski. I am a faculty member at Northwestern University and the director of the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Thank you so much for joining us for today's weekly virtual seminar of the Center. It's really a pleasure to have you with us. The mission of the Center is to create knowledge about digital media in Latinx and Latin American communities across the Americas. Today's speakers are leading scholars in this space. Jamil Marques is Associate Professor at Universidade Federal do Paraná, and Edna Miola is Associate Professor at Universidade Tecnológica Federal do Paraná. Facundo Suenzo, a doctoral student at Northwestern University and an affiliate at the Center for Latinx Digital Media, will introduce Edna and Jamil in just a minute. I am delighted to note that this quarter, our series is co-sponsored by the Alice Kaplan Institute for the Humanities, Affairs, the Center for Global Culture and Communication, the Department of Radio, Television and Film, the Latina and Latino Studies program, and the program in Latin American and Caribbean Studies. But before we go to the seminar, I would like to start by acknowledging that Northwestern is a community of learners situated within a network of historical and contemporary relationships with Native American tribes, communities, parents, students, and alumni. It is also in close proximity to an urban Native American community in Chicago and near several tribes in the Midwest. The Northwestern campus sits on the traditional homelands of the people of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ottawa, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. It was also a site of trade, travel, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other native tribes, and is still home to over 100,000 tribal members in the state of Illinois. It is within Northwestern's responsibility as an academic institution to disseminate knowledge about Native peoples and the institution's history with them. Consistent with the university's commitment to diversity and inclusion, Northwestern works towards building relationships with Native American communities through academic pursuits, partnerships, historical recognitions, community service, and enrollment efforts. Let me say briefly about how the seminar will unfold. First, Facundo will tell us more about Edna's and Jamil's research and career in just a minute. Then they will deliver their seminar. After that, we will open for questions. Please enter your questions in the Q&A function of the webinar at the bottom of your screen at any point in time. Once Edna and Jamil finish delivering their presentation, Facundo will moderate your questions. At the end, we will deliver some closing remarks. Once again, many thanks for joining us, and without further ado, Facundo, the screen is all yours.
Thank you very much, Pablo, and hello, everyone. I'm very honored to have been invited to today's seminar to introduce these incredible scholars, Professor Jamil Marques and Professor Edna Miola, and co-moderate this presentation at the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Jamil Marques is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at the Federal University of Paraná, Brazil. He works as a CNPq, the National Council for Scientific and Technological Development in Brazil, Productivity Research Fellow, and coordinates the research group on media, politics, and technology, PONTE. His research focuses on political communication, journalism, public opinion, and digital democracy. Dr. Marques supervises master and doctoral students for both political science and communication graduate programs. Professor Marques holds a degree in journalism from the Federal University of Ceará and a master and PhD in communication and contemporary culture, both from the Federal University of Minas Gerais. He has written more than 50 journal articles in prestigious peer-reviewed venues, such as the Journal of Communication, Journalism Studies, and Journalism Practice. His contributions to the field are also reflected in multiple books, chapters, and 4-book edited. He has also authored the book Cyberpolitics, published in 2016. Professor Jamil Marques is currently working on 2 projects. First, editorial journalism in comparative perspective, an exploration to the culture of opinion, criteria of editorial worthiness, and journalism as a political actor in Brazil and the United States. Second, political communication and digital transparency in the Brazilian case, an assessment of multidimensional factors influencing public control effectiveness, where Professor Edna also collaborated with. Today, we also have Professor Edna Miola, an associate professor at the Department of Language and Communication and graduate program of Planning and Public Governance at the Federal University of Technology, Paraná, Brazil. She's also a visiting research fellow at Kellogg Center, Michigan State University. Dr. Miola coordinates the research group on discourse, communication, and democracy. Her interests focus on political communication, government communication, public opinion, digital democracy, and public governance. Professor Miola obtained her degree in communication and advertising from the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, a master in science in contemporary communication and culture from the Federal University of Bahia, and her PhD in communication from the Federal University of Minas Gerais. Professor Miola has co-authored 4 book chapters, written more than 15 articles in peer-reviewed journals, and contributed papers in more than 20 conferences, both in national and international level. She is currently working on 3 research projects. The project Digital Democracy and Government Communication on Social Media, the project Government Communication Dilemma, Conflicts Between Propaganda and Public Interest, and she also participates in the project Political Communication and Digital Transparency in the Brazilian Case. Both Professor Jamil Marques and Professor Miola have exceptionally serviced the academic community, mentoring students in their institutions, and participating in editorial boards of prestigious journals. The titles of today's presentation is Trends in Political Communication Research, What We Can Learn from the Brazilian Case. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Marques and Professor Miola.
Thank you very much, Facundo, Pablo, Valerie, and Maura. We first want to thank the Northwestern University and the Center for Latinx Digital Media. You are doing an amazing job. Congratulations and thanks for the invitation. We really appreciate this opportunity. We were discussing some weeks ago about how important your work has been to Latin American researchers to give us visibility and to discuss some of the peculiarities surrounding our works. So thank you so much for this opportunity once again.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for having us today.
Okay, I'm start by sharing my screen. Do you want to start, Edna?
Okay, so let's go to the second slide.
Okay, the title of our presentation is Trends in Political Communication Research. What can we learn from the Brazilian case?
Okay. So, just as other Latin America countries, Brazil presents different expressions of political communication when compared to other societies. Our main argument throughout this seminar is that some concepts empirically tested or discussed in Europe and in the United States do not provide appropriate explanations for our realities.
Yes, in other words, our main argument is that some of the concepts which that are offered, that are built in their international scholarship, needs to be adapted when we try to understand Latin American environments. So what we will be doing throughout this presentation is to illustrate some of these concepts which are largely adopted by our international community, but turns out that when we bring such concepts to the Latin American context, we need to be a bit more careful about adopting them. So we have, for example, 5 dimensions we would like to discuss briefly and to illustrate to what extent they are being interpreted in our context. So these the 5 dimensions are journalism and the 4th branch rhetoric, populism, media and elections, parallelism and instrumentalization, and political economy of communication. So we are going to explore each one of these key dimensions in order to explain how they are interpreted differently in our context, okay? For example, the first one, the idea of journalism and the fourth branch rhetoric. The notion of the fourth branch rhetoric in Brazil is not the same one traditionally sustained in the American model of journalism. That is, even so the Brazilian press claims to be impartial, it has adapted the fourth branch rhetorical in a very particular way. According to Albuquerque, Brazilian journalists have employed this rhetoric to legitimize their role as a kind of poder moderador. It's like, it's not the same kind of fourth branch that we have, for example, in the American setting. That is, mainstream journalism in Brazil tries to influence the decision-making processes. We saw this very clearly during the impeachments of Collor and Rousseff in 2016. So the press tries to have some power over the decisions that are taken in state institutions. Do you want to talk about populism, Edna?
Okay. Indeed. The second dimension is populism. The notion of populism is also unique in Latin America countries. According to Silvio Weisbord and Adriana Amado, our brand of populism is ideologically different from contemporary right-wing populism in Europe and the United States. It's not a xenophobic anti-immigration reaction to multiculturalism and globalization, but rather it represents the tradition of nationalist, anti-elite, anti-US movements in Latin America politics. This is why some analytical categories aim to understand media populism in the European and North American settings cannot be applied automatically in our researchers. Some aspects of traditional politics remain relevant when the electorate decides whom to vote for. This is about elections now I'm talking about. So we are thinking about the features of coalitions and the current economic and political situation, for example. But it's undeniable that elections in Brazil have become a prime media event. The 1989 presidential election in Brazil is a milestone since it contributed to news organizations being viewed as a key political player in the country, even today. Another two aspects are worth mentioning. Brazil has the free political advertising time. We call it Horário Gratuito de Propaganda Eleitoral, HGPE. This is a time slot on TV and radio channels offered to candidates and political parties to make their messages public. The candidates do not need to pay to air their content because the state funds the HGPE. Funding campaigns is also tied to forms of public mobilization. So being the individual contribution in Brazil, rare, really, really rare. This requires growing amounts of public budget. And this landscape, it has high expenses on political marketing, and official control over the donations opens space for corruption through elections occult funds, what we call Caixa 2. Maybe you heard about it when during the scandal of Petrobras.
Yes, and indeed, so this is why we need to be very careful when trying to adopt some of the concepts which are largely shared in the international community about media and elections. Indeed, Brazil is a different country, for example, if we compare it to the United States, because in Brazil we have this free political advertising time, while in the US, most of the time on TV or radio are paid by the candidates themselves or by their supporters or their committees. And so this is a bit different from what happens in Brazil. So we also must be very careful about using the literature concerning media and elections, since we have our peculiarities. And there is another dimension, there is a fourth dimension we decided to bring to this presentation that regards parallelism and instrumentalization. First, as we know, party systems in Latin American countries are clearly different from those in Europe and the United States. For example, in the US, we have two main parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, but in Brazil, we have about 35 political parties officially registered in our superior electoral court. And also this is another difference. We have a superior electoral court specifically designed to take care of our elections. So the idea of parallelism between party and the press is different in the Brazilian case, mainly because we have a different political system. Plus, the ideological incoherence is a hallmark of Brazilian politics. Our parties are a mess. So we have parties which are, first place, they claim they are leftist or right-wing parties, but they have different connections, or they can associate with parties that we didn't expect to, and this is due only to their own convenience. So according to the convenience in each election, they can be closer or not. So this is a bit crazy because the ideological incoherence is a hallmark in our politics. That's why the relationship between parties and newspapers in our country can be marked by off and on alignments. In other words, the similarities or divergences in their stances can be related to a temporal context or only to specific issues. So we don't have, for example, a lot of scholars used to compare Latin American countries with Italy when they are talking about media systems. So they also used to characterize our setting in Latin America as pluralist and polarized. But we think that this classification, this categorization is not enough to explain the phenomena we have in our region. And this is why, this is because, for example, we don't have the same kind of parties, and we don't have the same kind of political tradition, and we don't have the same alignments between parties and newspapers, because most of these alignments are temporal. So they are tied to specific contexts or specific issues. For example, we had since 2018, we had a lot of discussion about the Bolsonaro government and how Bolsonaro and the Brazilian press are having a lot of problems, are having a lot of strifes among themselves. But when the country was discussing the pension reform in 2019, the newspapers and the Bolsonaro government had a convergence between their interests. So this is funny to observe in the Brazilian case. This parallelism can occur sometimes when a specific issue is at stake. So this notion of parallelism that we use to import automatically sometimes need to be interpreted differently in our region, as one of my colleagues, Afonso de Albuquerque, argues.
Yeah, sure. We tend to think more about an economic parallelism, since most of our journals adopt a liberal economy perspective. So they tend to defend this vision, no matter what government is. So I will talk about some of the political economic of communication that is not actually a dimension, but a field of studies, but they are quite important in the Brazilian and in the Latin American context. So we also take a different perspective concerning media regulation. Brazilian studies in political economy of communication were originally interested in how the military government shaped our broadcasting and telecommunication systems. The dictatorship ruling the country from 1964 to 1985 paved the way for commercial broadcasting, leaving behind the public models then thriving in most of Europe. This made Brazilian studies in political economy to be politically engaged, aimed to fight against official censorship, for example. After the redemocratization, the field focused on media oligopolies and family-owned media groups. We defend that an approximation between the political communication and the political economy fields could contribute to understanding how the degree of plurality of journalistic coverage and space for debates in the public sphere are affected by the organization of the communication market. Also, political communication scholars must consider the consequences of digital culture on social media political aspects, such as inequalities in access to communication technologies, the phenomenon of platformization and datification, issues concerning privacy and surveillance, and the commodification of social interactions. All of these themes profoundly discussed by the political economy of communication.
So, as we can see, we tried to illustrate our argument by highlighting 5 key dimensions where some concepts which are widely shared by the international community, and these concepts need to be reinterpreted when they are taken, when we consider our settings. So we talked about journalism and the idea of fourth branch rhetoric, populism, media and elections, parallelism and instrumentalization, and political economy of communication. So we suggest, therefore, that we cannot automatically adopt such concepts since they were originally aimed to think about other settings. We must also criticize such concepts. For example, the very idea of parallelism, as I just told before, cannot be simply automatically used in our context. So against this background, we may ask, if we as in Latin America, if we can provide new insights concerning political communication, why do our studies face so many challenges to circulate in top-ranked journals? This is a feeling we have that we don't have too many Latin American scholars publishing in top-ranked journals in communication, and we are also a bit worried about this. And as a matter of fact, we also just have a project, a funding for a project approved by the CNPq, by the Brazilian government, and our intention is exactly to study the main burdens or the main challenges that our researchers face when they are trying to publish in top-ranked journals. And we are a bit worried about this because we know that we have a lot of interesting findings, and we know that we have different interpretations that could indeed try to give a new tone or a new conception to these definitions that are widely accepted in political communication. So we want to ask, why do our studies face so many challenges to circulate in top-ranked journals? And And it's funny because if we take a look, the international scholarship has discussed, for example, over the last years, the idea of de-westernization, aiming to understand the challenges of publishing research from and about the global south. I brought here an example. We have two tweets by Rasmus Kleis Nielsen, and he is an amazing scholar. He runs the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, Oxford University. And Rasmus, some months ago, in September 2020, he was exactly discussing, taking part in a conference organized by the International Journal of Press Politics. And this conference, at least the roundtable he was talking about in this case, was concerned with the following issue: the challenges of publishing research from and about the global south. So a lot of important scholars were invited, and it's interesting to realize what Rasmus was arguing in these two tweets, just for you to understand where we want to go. He says, urgent for many reasons. This discussion is urgent for many reasons, including intrinsic importance of understanding media and communications across the world in different contexts, addressing institutional structures that often privilege already privileged global North scholars over colleagues elsewhere, opportunity of learning, and he brings a last point. Last point may seem blindingly obvious, but amount of work, a lot of works coming out from the US and sometimes the European Union seems to think issues such as populism, identity politics, polarization, weak elite adherence to norms and institutions, and weakly institutionalized journalism. A lot of these works, according to Rasmus, think this phenomena is a new one. So, but they are not new one, mainly if we consider the context in Latin America. So we have these two issues. We know that as Latin Americans, we can provide new insights to concepts that are widely accepted. This on the one side, and in the other side, we have even top researchers as Rasmus, which are arguing, contending that that Europeans and North Americans are losing the opportunity of learning also with us. So this is what we want to stress now in the second part of our presentation. Okay.
Well, this doesn't mean that we agree when other researchers say that de-Westernization is more celebrated than practiced. We can point out some factors burdening our dialogue with other regions. We can say here about the English as a lingua franca, the inequalities of access to editors and editorial boards, the academic scientific system in case of Brazil that seems to be satisfied with publishing in national journals, and the lack of funding for or partnerships with private actors. So Jamil is going to talk about the first one.
Yeah, we are going to explore these 4 dimensions here while we have some time. First one, English as lingua franca. Ana Cristina Suzina examined a series of data regarding the invisibility of Latin America scientific production. She throws into question to what extent English as lingua franca limits the encounters between Western theory and scientific cultures rooted in other languages. We indeed have a robust scientific culture among Latin American partners, we do have our own open access and widely accessed journals, but we are still struggling to go further due to language skills, due to our lack of English skills in some cases. Sometimes editors and reviewers are not ready to understand this issue. So maybe the international community could find a way to at least to ease this kind of problem that we as Latin American scholars are facing. And a second burden that we identify concerns the inequalities of access to editors and editorial boards in top-ranked journals. I have some friends, Afonso Albuquerque, Tayane Oliveira, Marcelo, and Sofia. They wrote an article in 2020 where they analyzed the composition of the editorial boards of scientific journals included in Clarivate's Journal of Citation Reports, the JCR. Albuquerque and his colleagues found a strong imbalance in favor of the US to the detriment of the non-Western countries. In other words, structural factors foster asymmetries in communication research. This kind of problem makes us insist on justifying Latin America-based studies relevance. Every single time I try to submit an article to top-ranked journals, the editor always asks me to add, why does this study is important to the broad community? Yes, it seems to be a fair question. I will give you that. However, at the same time, investigations with a local focus do not face the same challenge as long as they come from the US or Europe. So if you are writing about a local newspaper in an American state, the editors will not ask you to justify this to the broad literature. So this is a bit awkward, at least as we see it. And we also are regularly asked to compare the extent to which our cases can be compared to the ones in North America and Europe. Why not the opposite? Why not American and European researchers do not have, why do they don't need to compare their findings with our settings? So we also should take care of this and pay attention to this.
Yeah, and we usually see these comparisons highlighting how we have less resources, or we have miles to go to reach the point where these North global countries are. So I will talk about the academic and scientific system in Brazil. And we see lots of researchers with so many years in their careers, and they have so much prestige internally in the country, but they seem to be satisfied with publishing in national journals. The endogenous practices are stimulated by maintaining traditional systems of funding and evaluation graduate programs and researchers. So they are quite successful doing what they do to obtain to obtain funds from the agencies in Brazil, and to have their articles accepted by the local periodicals, but they don't don't have to seek for other audiences. So the scientific culture in Brazilian universities usually resists private funding also. There is a shared fear that partnerships with private institutions may bring about conflicts of interest. Therefore, much of our funding continues to come from state agencies. And when we face a scenario where public resources are limited, while the demand for research support is growing, so we can say that as long as this is not properly addressed, it will remain a difficult task to carry out surveys or to organize focus groups, for example, because they are very expensive. In other words, collecting empirical data remains a barrier to our investigations, limiting our opportunities in many international journals that require this kind of studies.
Yep, and we know it's true that we have to face such burdens and that we don't, and that trying to address these problems does not depend on us. For example, the use of English as lingua franca or the inequalities of access to editors and editorial boards. However, we do think that some epistemological and methodological factors can be improved if we want to expand the circulation of Brazilian research in political communication. In other words, we understand that some of the flaws that we will indicate soon are maybe common sense, or maybe why are you talking about this? It's everybody knows this. Even so, there is a relevant number of articles that we read or review presenting such weaknesses. And so we decided also not only to cry about the problems we have to face, but also we decided to close our presentation some suggestions to improve the articles published, written by Brazilian scholars, so they can maybe have more chances to be accepted. First one, it's very important that in Brazil we change a little bit about the typical structure that we use when we are writing our articles. That's the slide. And for example, we feel that many articles in Brazil, we spend too much time reviewing the literature and using exhausting quotations. However, the craft of write articles to be submitted to top-ranked journals seems to have changed rapidly over the recent years. We have noticed that it's necessary to invest more in presenting results and in a discussion topic dedicated to advancing the knowledge. Many times, we Brazilians are happy to simply describe a new case when this is not enough for international reviewers.
Yeah, the second suggestion is to avoid conceptual imprecisions. We are kind of addicted to using, for example, the term media. However, such concept can designate a broad set of phenomena, services, interests, professionals, technologies, and practices, characterizing contemporary mass communication. Besides, macro categories are generally associated with generalizations that are not supported by the data presented in the articles. So, for the last topic, it's crucial to train our researchers to avoid problems concerning data consistency. Often, the use of techniques such as content analysis is markedly subjective. And in this case, it is always necessary to detail how was the content categorized, how many researchers took part in the process, was a reliability test performed? Is there a code book? Where did the categories come from? What was done in case of disagreement among coders? In the Brazilian case, giving access to data sets is largely uncharted territory. To summarize, without improving such aspects, the area of political communication in Brazil will have difficulties accumulating knowledge. It is it is as if one had to start practically from scratch due to the methodological inconsistency of most studies carried out so far.
Well, we are running out of time, and we hope that our presentation can be helpful for researchers in our region. We must adopt a more critical approach concerning the concepts originally thought to think about other realities. And if there's someone interested in contacting us, here are the information concerning our research groups, Ponte and Discord, and here are our websites and our email addresses. So if anyone is interested in discussing a bit more about this, we will be glad to write back and talk to you a bit more. Once again, thank you so much, Pablo, Mora, Facundo, Valerie, and the Northwestern University for this opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Marques and Professor Miola, for this very thought-provocative presentation. I will first encourage the audience to ask their questions using the Q&A button in the bottom of the screen. But I will start with one of my questions. I feel like we're very represented by the tension you mentioned between the national system sort of like structure and the tension with the global structure or issues or constraints. So and particularly when scholars are based or most of their production are like evaluated by the local scientific, so they have to navigate this tension and constraints in both like the local and the international level. So I'm curious about what do you think that junior scholars like myself and many probably in the audience as well should start doing or like thinking in trying to navigate this tension. Probably if you go to study to the US or to Europe, and then you would like to come back to your home country, what type of strategies or activity do you think that young or junior scholars should start thinking about or reflect on?
Thank you so much for the question, Facundo. Do you want to start answering, Edna?
Yeah, I can start and you can complete. Well, this is a thing that we are developing in our research groups, that the sense of we need to be read by others to reach other audiences, and to do it we have to know the literature, the foreign literature, but also learn from this literature how to structure our research so we can dialogue with them without this kind of barrier that or kind of strangeness that is posed by different realities. I think Jamil has been doing this very well with their students.
Oh, this is a very interesting question, very provocative question. Thank you, Facundo. Well, as far as I'm concerned, for Brazilian students face some additional challenges that we as professors face when we are trying to publish our articles. For example, throughout this presentation, we were talking about some of the main burdens that are constraining our articles to be published in top-ranked international journals. But it's crazy to realize that in Brazil, students, junior students, PhD students, or master's students, or even undergraduate students, they are simply not allowed to submit articles to some of our national journals. Our journals, most of the journals in Brazil, they demand that a doctor, a PhD researcher, a researcher with a PhD degree to be the submitting leader. the leader of the submission. So this is a bit crazy because we have this kind of system in our own country. So journals in our own country do not accept articles submitted and prepared by students. But if you take a look, other journals of other international journals, they just don't care what is your degree, as long as your argument is strong enough. If you have a good and original argument, if you have a rationale that reveals the field and that is robust concerning methodology, you will probably get published. But in Brazil, this is not possible for most of our journals. So our students have to face this kind of challenge. And this is a bit crazy because this is exactly what our system, our evaluation system in our PhD programs we request. They said, journals which publish articles written by doctors will have a better grade, a better classification. And I think this is a bit crazy that we should think about this when we are, if we really want to internationalize our research findings.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. This is for sure something that to keep thinking about. So we have a couple of questions from the audience. I will start with the first one. Cristiano Mota asked about the key dimensions that you presented. In some ways, if you consider that the approach of the researchers and its different relations with people's ordinary lives, besides of cultural countries' difference and its habitants, what could be explaining this kind of disconnection between the researchers made in Latin America and in the rest of the world, considering that independently of the specific aspect, the key dimensions, the theoretical shows that by the author, the way that people are reacting around the world is the same, right?
Well, you can answer, Jamil.
Okay. We have to, we don't know exactly. It's a good question, Cristiano. What we have learned over the last years when we were trying to submit our articles is that sometimes people, international reviewers or editors, just don't understand the many peculiarities that we have here in our continent. So we have this kind of disconnection because many times we have a kind of mess, for example, in our political system, and our political system sometimes is so hard to understand, or sometimes we have so many instabilities. Let's say, for example, after the impeachments that we had in Brazil. So we have this kind of disconnection, and this kind of disconnection is not only tied to theoretical concepts, but also to what is really happening, as you said, in people's ordinary lives. So this is important to have in mind. But I also have another suggestion to make, that is maybe the fact that we have a different approach about what doing research means. In Brazil, we still have a kind of approach that is kind of afraid of quantitative studies. And we used to think, at least in Brazil, that interpreting and that writing our impressions about some concepts or some events in political communication will be enough. And I think that we have different grammars that can be one of the reasons to this disconnection about Brazil and other and the research that is made in other countries. So I think that we have different approaches, and this is, as Edna said in the last question, this is one of the things that we try to reinforce when we work with our students. Basically, we used to discuss international articles published in international top-ranked journals, and we are always highlighting to our students the importance of understanding the structure of these articles that are published in such journals, because they have been traditionally trained to prepare huge quotations and huge literature reviews, but we feel that the connection, to establish a connection between what we research and what international journals publish, we have to change this grammar. We have to change the structure of our articles, for example. So there are different kinds of disconnections, let's say. For example, there is a disconnection between what about our realpolitik in Latin America and the realpolitik in Europe and the US. And we also have different kinds of approach about how to perform our research and our analysis. Edna?
Yeah, sure. And I feel like such concepts like instrumentalization, this is my experience. When we talk about instrumentalization, we have a clear picture of state being intervening in communication, especially in TV and radio stations. I feel that this kind of instrumentalization that is quite different from instrumentalization described by Paulo Mancini and Daniel Hailing. The foreign audience cannot see how this can be called as instrumentalization. But this is quite common in our countries. And also our public communication, our public broadcasting, our systems are quite different. They are evidently instrumentalized by the states. So we have difficulty to explain things like this. Well, but we are in the way to train ourselves and our students to deal with it.
Absolutely, thank you. We have another question from Julia. Great seminar. I would like to know if the professors, if you feel that when evaluating articles written by authors from the Global South, researchers from the US and Europe tend to have sort of a colonial look to the investigation. For example, they tend to feel interest by the cases because they are different from their reality, but do not consider that sometimes theory and insights from research of the global north do not match reality from other countries.
Well, I tend to agree with Julia. We are kind of exotic to the editors from the global north. The fact our politicians are seen as caricatural, even though we have some of these kind of leaders in other countries such as US, now it's very common to compare Trump to Bolsonaro, but we had a lot of Bolsonaros and Getúlio Vargas and Jânio Quadros in the Brazilian history that show this kind of peculiarity. But it kind of diminished our ability to explain reality, because we are seen as I said, exotic and not a parameter to understand the realities also.
Yeah, I'd like just to make a quick remark about this. It's interesting to realize that sometimes the editors in international journals used to trust some reviewers from our countries. And this is funny because sometimes some reviewers, I submitted some articles to international journals, and I'm pretty sure that some of the reviewers are Brazilians because of what they were asking us to do in order to revise the submission, the paper. And for example, there is a lot of politicization in Brazilian studies, like politically engaged papers, and we try to avoid this, but sometimes even Brazilian reviewers try to attract us to this kind of approach. And it's interesting to realize how different international reviewers and Brazilian reviewers are when they are addressing their concerns about the articles. Yes, I'm not sure. I'm not 100% positive that these researchers are really Brazilian, but I have my suspects.
Yeah, maybe when they are not Brazilians or they are not from countries like ours, they ask to us to write a full section of our history or our political context to explain how this related to our research. So we have to spend lots of words reiterating the same aspects that lots of articles already described.
Yes. Well, we have 3 more questions, so I'll probably ask you if you can, one of you, address each question, so we have a time for each one and be mindful of everybody's time. So the question from Maria Celeste: thank you very much for raising all these important issues of inequality in the practice of scholarly publication. Following up of what you were discussing at the beginning, what do you think are the main factor or aspects of media and communication today that are given for granted or not questioned in mainstream global North academia, but that a closer look to the Brazilian or other Latin American cases show that those are actually not the norm in those contexts? Thank you.
It's an amazing question, Maria Celeste. Thank you so much. To have a quick answer, about 1 year ago, I published an article with one of my students, Pablo Pimentel, in journalism studies. And one of our discoveries is that when we talk about media systems internationally, most of the contributions about media systems do not fit in the Brazilian context. For example, in Brazil, we have a huge country. Brazil is a huge country, geographically speaking. So our territory is huge, and so. But what is important to understand is that in Brazil we have at least regarding the broadcasting and TV stations, we have a huge station named Cabeça de Rede, so it's the center of the network, and we have in different states local stations that retransmits the programs, the shows. And this is funny because in Brazil we have a different setting, because at the same time we have parallelism and instrumentalization, because most of these local stations are a lot of times they are instrumentalized. So the international literature, for example, is not ready to understand how a single country, how a single media system can coexist in this media system, parallelism and instrumentalization. So this is one of the findings that we believe that are not the norm in other European or American contexts, but that are really they are a reality, and they influence the everyday coverage of journalism in politics.
So Hernan asks, how do you think political communication will evolve in Latin America with communist propaganda in the internet, paramilitary groups threatening journalists, like in the Mexican cartels and Comando Vermelho and PCC in Brazil?
Briefly, I hope we can understand more about the mobilization of the public in outside the mass media, because we used to think that the left movements could use internet in a way that they can mobilize people. But now we see in Brazil that the left wing did a better job articulating population over about some issues, and they can be considered the partially responsible for the Bolsonaro's elections. So we can see the public mobilization, the popular mobilization in a different way. I hope so.
Okay. Danilo says, as you know, there are Brazilian journals well placed in the Brazilian ranking that publish 100% of their articles in English and are ranked in Scopus 2. Although often in lower side score positions. I assume that it is important for Brazilian researchers to choose to submit and publish in these journals too, in order to strengthen them. Do you agree with this?
Yes, I do, Danilo. Thank you, Danilo. You are a good friend from Brazil. And Danilo, yes, I think you are really correct in raising this point. We have some really important journals in Brazil which are paying attention to how to be included in international rankings. Brazilian Journalism Research, BJR, is one of the main journals we have in our country. So I think that Fabio Pereira, for example, he is doing an amazing job in BJR. And yes, I always try to encourage my students to publish there. And you are true, you are correct when you say this. And I just would add that the burden that most of our journals have concerning the degree of the authors, this is a burden that it doesn't make sense, because at least in my opinion, the quality of the argument should be the main factor to decide if the paper is publishable or not.
Great, thank you. And our last question from Rayana. Thank you for your great presentation. I wanted to ask about the efforts the international academic community should also do to include work from other places. How not to reinforce that the US and Europe contexts are the norm, including in terms of methodological approaches and theoretical frameworks. As a Brazilian doing my doctoral studies in the US, I have faced the challenge of having to justify why studying Brazil or Brazilian.
Wow, good question, Rayana. In the end of our presentations, we talked about how some strategies to deal with this context, and we asked not to develop in reaction of this a colonized perspective about our research objects. So maybe you can think about our research objects as valuable as any other, and try to dialogue in the same level with the other literature.
Yeah, just a quick remark. Thank you, Rayana, for your question. And yes, this is true. What we are trying to do when we are challenged with this kind of question, why to study Brazil is important, we are always trying to reshape our research problem in order to show how our interpretation and how our findings can also change how people in other continents understand the concept that is widely adopted. So we used to say, for example, oh, the concept of parallelism that is traditionally accepted in the international community is this kind, has this design. But we think that parallelism in Brazil has to be fought in another way. So, for example, in this article with Pablo Pimentel, we decided to expand the idea of parallelism to address not only political parallelism, but also to invest in the idea of economic parallelism. So some newspapers in Brazil are not directly interested in political parallelism with some parties. Indeed, they are interested in parties or governments which have as main target to approve economic reforms. So it's more a kind of economic parallelism than political parallelism, at least in Brazilian newspaper editorials. So this is what we are trying this is this kind of strategy that we are trying to develop in our research groups, trying to show how some of these concepts are not appropriate to explain other settings. And yes, sometimes the editors used to accept this kind of argument. Thank you so much for your question.
And thank you, Edna and Jamil, for a spectacular presentation. Truly terrific. We have, had a record number of attendees and questions, and we have stayed, another,
nice.
6 or 7 minutes at the end. This has been very, very insightful. Thank you, Facundo, for great moderation as always. And I invite everybody to join us for next week's seminar of the Center for Latinx Digital Media with Arturo Arriagada of Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez in Santiago de Chile. Everybody has a great rest of your day and weeks. Bye, Jamil. Bye, Edna.
Thank you so much, Pablo, Facundo, Val. Bye-bye.